In the meantime, I'll be introducing Sally Mubarak. Sally is a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews, funded by the world-leading St. Andrews Scholarship in Classics. Her work examines war and trauma in the Roman Republic and the wider ancient Mediterranean, and also focuses on ancient imperialism and military expansion, marginalized groups in the ancient world, the human experience of war and violence, bioarchaeology, collective memory, and the organization of ancient societies through social norms, ritual, and space. A lot of exciting stuff. In addition to this doctoral research, she holds the position of lab manager for the Center for Archaeology, Technology, and History, or CATH, at the University of St. Andrews. So please join me in welcoming Sally with her paper, which is entitled Whitewashing the Samnites, Roman Imperialism, and the Modern Legacy of Empire.
Thank you so much to the organizers for having me. I feel quite privileged to be amongst such an amazing lineup of scholars, especially discussing important um, things such as what we are today. I want to begin by giving a little bit of background on the thought process behind the research. So I came to this topic while I was working on my research masters on early Roman imperialism. During my experience in academia, I felt at times, and often as the only woman of color in a room full of ancient military historians, that my views or readings of the ancient source material didn't quite match with the perspectives of my colleagues. I also felt at the time that there was a disconnect between my lived experience and what I was bringing into my research, and the backgrounds and perspectives that my peers were contributing. In In 2020, we saw the Black Lives Matter campaign in response to ongoing police brutality and racially motivated violence towards Black communities in the US. In Classics and Ancient History, these movements sparked an international exposition of the deeply embedded and systemic structures of exclusion and discrimination within our field. In November 2020, Leonard and Lovat published a report on equality and diversity in classics in the UK that further spotlighted some of the inequities in our discipline. It found that of the 294 staff and students who responded to their survey, 59% of BAME or BIPOC students and professional staff experienced discrimination within a teaching context. In contrast, 63% of white males responded that they had never witnessed any discrimination in the teaching environment. Outside of the teaching environment, presentation, submission, and publication rates of scholarship can be used to examine the dominant academic discourses within ancient history and classics. So Kamash in 2019 examined the presenter programs of 22 Roman archaeology conferences from 1995 to 2019. Of the 2,068 papers and posters presented over this period, 2.4% were by BAME individuals. Furthermore, 46% of papers presented over this period focused on the regions of Britain and Italy, despite the Roman Empire covering far wider geographical regions and groups. So Kamash identified that this is a reflection of the narrow focus scholars have of the Roman Empire, which itself is also a reflection of the underrepresentation that appears in our discipline. Scholars are more likely to show interest in the regions with which they can identify through existing power struggles that resonate with them. And given the statistics like those published by Leonard and Lovat in 2020, where more than 50% of those identifying as people of color had experienced discrimination, these varied experiences and perspectives are, unsurprisingly, often pushed out of the discipline and therefore lost from scholarly production. But what does this have to do with the Samnites, you ask? Well, I was sitting with my own experiences and thought if marginalized individuals within our modern discipline have vastly different experiences of conducting research and moving through the academy than some of our more widely represented peers, how does this impact the output of scholarship itself? And the questions that are being asked. How does our reading of the ancient evidence, which we know privileges the Roman perspective, impact how we as ancient historians view the groups that fought with and ultimately were conquered by Rome? So I started to dig into the modern historiography of Roman imperialism and re-examine some of the ancient evidence with these questions in mind. So I recognize that I'll be distilling a very complicated issue into a short paper, and in this talk, I will be highlighting just a few of the ways in which dominant colonial narratives underlie the scholarship of early Italy. I'll be focusing on the period of the Middle Republic, and my talk will be divided into three parts. So, Roman imperialism and tracking the rise of Rome has been a driving paradigm behind most scholarly works on central and southern Italy in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. The peoples of these regions are often seen as little more than an inconvenient disruption to Rome's inevitable domination. The narrative of Rome's conquest of Italy is obviously derived from the ancient literary sources, which typically define groups and relationships using dichotomies and oppositional terms. And for a wide range of reasons, and as has long been recognized in modern scholarship, the authors of our ancient sources often characterize groups outside of their dominant axes of power as the other. This is especially true for the Samnites, the label given to peoples who were inhabitants of central and southern Italy, residing along the chain of the central Apennine Mountains. These people fought against Rome in a series of conflicts between 343 and 290 BCE, roughly, and their defeat and incorporation marked a key turning point in the creation of Rome's Italian Empire. Our current approaches to the Samnites are rooted in preconditioned notions of Roman versus local and rely on colonial and Western frameworks, which favor the Roman imperial narrative. Roman Republican studies have tended towards an insular discussion where the traditional and dominant narratives of development have relied on Eurocentric understandings of Roman imperialism. Although recent developments in scholarship have attempted to reassert the agency of local groups in their relationships with Rome through concepts such as migration, connectivity, and elite networks, these concepts have largely been limited in their application to the Samnites and the Middle Republic more widely. So this talk aims to explore the colonial foundations of the discipline and highlight some of the implications of these on groups that have not received as much attention in our study of the ancient world. But first, I'd like to highlight some of the undercurrents that have shaped and directed scholarship on the ancient world. So in classics and ancient history, we throw around terms like Hellenization, Romanization, Roman colonialism, expansion, occupation, imperialism, and conquest. And these are all terms which center Rome or Greece and place Greco-Roman hegemony in a binary opposition to native populations. And they are also examples of what we call the Western approach. The Western approach is, according to Hall and others, grounded in a very specific set of functions based on discourses of the West and the rest. These functions dictate how scholars select, interpret, and process source material, and they operate as follows. So, firstly, to allow for societies to be characterized, categorized, and classified, and this provides them with a tool to structure groups. Stereotyping, a technique which reduces and simplifies societies to allow for empirical reasoning. Three, it provides a model through which we can, oh, I'll just jump back a second. So for example, Western is equal to urban and developed, and non-Western is non-industrial, rural, and agricultural, which is undeveloped. Three, it provides a model through which they can compare and contrast societies and thus allows for societies to be positioned as closer or further away from the Western center. And four, it provides an evaluation criterion so that societies can be ranked. So for example, West equals developed and good, and non-West is underdeveloped, bad, and undesirable. The function of the Western machine therefore provides research frameworks that are actively applied to non-Western and colonized societies. And it should be noted that this framework is heavily influenced by classical knowledge and ancient literary sources in particular. And I'd just like to highlight them here because these undercurrents are going to be coming up as we discuss both the modern and ancient evidence, the modern scholarship and ancient evidence. Okay, so our literary sources. The Samnites were inhabitants of central and southern Italy, and references to the Samnites in the ancient literature are sporadic. The earliest literary references to Samnium and the Samnites come from Greek sources, dated to the first half of the 4th century BCE. The majority of extant literary information on the Samnites comes from the likes of Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus in the late 1st century. However, there doesn't seem to be much actual Roman interest in the Samnites until around the Social War, so 91 to 88 BCE, when the Samnites and Samnite identity played a really important role in shaping opposition to Rome. So 4th century sources include references to a Samnite ethnos, and they refer to the Sonnetai, focusing largely on ethnographic descriptions. These and other Greek texts from the later half of the 4th century reflect the use of the ethnic term, and they're used to indicate the peoples of Samnium. It also, however, includes people of Samnite descent resident in Campania, who were identified as distinct from the original Samnite settlers. The Latin sources are mostly centered on Samnite interactions and conflicts with Rome, whereas the Greek sources took an ethnographic approach and emphasized the great resources of the Roman state. Consequently, these analysts have created a historical framework based on contemporary socio-political experiences of their class, imbuing the literary record with their own inherent biases. For example, Livy's speeches of Samnite leaders provide only generalized criticisms of Rome, and they say little about Samnites themselves. So the Romanocentricity of the ancient evidence already frames how modern scholars have approached central and southern Italy from the second half of the first millennium BCE. And Rome's growing presence in the Italian peninsula and its victories over Pyrrhus and Hannibal throughout the 3rd century had ideological consequences for the peoples of Italy, who became rustici. So foreign languages were not only alien in these sources, but were depicted as unintelligible and a sign of the deficient intellect of the speakers, just as the Greeks reasserted their centrality and primacy within groups of surrounding barbarians. The Romans also asserted their superiority to the Italian peoples through the polarity urbanitas and rusticatus. So these tropes were a tool commonly deployed in literature from the late Republic and were used by Roman annalists who constructed a rural and barbarian other. And it was set in juxtaposition to Roman urbanity and sophistication. Central Italians were not, however, only depicted negatively. So we see more nuanced and positive descriptions as well in the annalistic sources of the late Republic and the early Empire. And they include depictions of Central Italians as brave, rustic, and masculine, or according to Herodotus' ethnographic system, as rugged soldiers from rough lands, also austere or masculine. Livy's famous passage, where he quotes them as montane atque agrestus, has generally been taken as at face value by scholars to suggest that either Samnite society was organized around raiding by the rugged mountain people, or that this was the only Roman understanding of Samnite society. Emma Dench, however, has also identified that this passage refers to varieties of economy which existed in the region. So she highlights the terms culti and agrestus as pastoralists and agriculturalists. So there are descriptions of Samnite luxury and bravery and masculinity, as well as negative representations in terms of them being unsophisticated. In modern scholarship, it's commonly accepted that Livy tended to emphasize or invent Roman successes at the cost of omitting Samnite achievements or developments. This is something that has been perpetuated by the modern scholars who have subscribed to the Samnite tropes presented by the ancient sources. So in particular, I'm going to bring in Theodore Mommsen as an example, because everyone references him. Anyone who talks about early Roman imperialism references him. So for example, Mommsen began his first volume by outlining ethnic categories of Italian tribes, races, or stocks as a foundation for his historical discussion. Mommsen applied a contemporary colonial understanding of ethnicity and divided, categorized, and organized the groups he thought were occupying Italy during the end of the regal period of Rome. So throughout his work, Roman history, the Samnites are positioned as diametrically opposite to Roman organization and success. Mommsen often placed the Samnites and Romans in opposition, so he uses the terms that refer to Samnites as Samnite hordes or Samnite multitudes. He refers to the Gauls, Celts, Etrurians, and Sabines in the same way, whereas Roman troops are discussed in terms of Roman armies and Roman settlers, so organized methodical groups. This contrast, whether it was conscious or unconscious, reflects his characterization of the Romans as an organized and intrinsically structured society, defending itself against the tribal hill people, the Samnites, which threatened what Mommsen calls Rome's hegemony. The ancient image of a poor and disorganized Samnium was perpetuated and emphasized by others, such as Salmon in his Samnium and the Samnites in 1967. But modern depopulation of the area in the 1960s and 70s also compounded the biases of the ancient sources. So as locals moved out of the area, and studies on the Samnites from the later half of the 20th century mirrored the contemporary region's poverty and marginality. Salmon's attempt to incorporate the limited material evidence that was available resulted in the first comprehensive historical account of ancient Samnium. However, his work opens by placing the Samnites in opposition to the Romans. So he says, of all the tribes and nations with whom the Romans found themselves obliged to dispute the supremacy of Italy, none were more formidable than the Samnites of Samnium. This juxtaposition is carried throughout Salmon's work, perpetuating ancient preconceptions of the Samnites as something called opikoi, or as Livy's stubborn mountain tribe. Salmon's work, although sympathetic in some ways to the Samnites, sets up the Roman conquest as inevitable and the unification into Rome's empire is almost predestined. Similarly, Oakley also relied on the ethnographic and historical record to identify potential hill fort sites, and then visited and recorded those sites where he found Samnite walls. He identified them through their polygonal walling. Oakley's Western colonial worldview is apparent here because he compounded polygonal walling with rural fortifications and thus primitive or uncivilized societies. So Oakley also made empirical generalizations in his work. So where he had identified polygonal walling in an area, he ventured further to assume that this meant that all archaeological remains from that region and that time period were also Samnite. And he actually says the best way to be certain that one has identified a new Samnite fortified site is to have found its polygonal walling. This form of reasoning, however, does not stack up with some of the archaeological evidence that we'll discuss later. And this was published in the same year as Graham Barker's study of the Biferno Valley. So each of these works offered a contribution to the ongoing discussion on the nature of Samnium and the Samnites and on Roman imperialism. And Oakley offered a traditional Romanocentric view of the Samnites. And although his volume was nominally focused on the archaeology of hill forts, he relied primarily on Livy and the other ancient literary sources to construct his wider Samnite context. Barker's work focused more directly on the archaeological evidence, but he always falls back on the Roman literature to contextualize it, which, I mean, as you do, but we'll see that that's not always the most accurate way to do things. So Densher's work, on the other hand, and she published this in the same year, in 1995, represented something rather different. So she scrutinized ancient literary evidence and identified that literary tropes have been consistently applied to the Samnites by both modern historians and ancient writers. This work demonstrated that the representation of the Samnites as a barbarian other by the classical authors aligned with a wider pattern of othering of foreign groups in the Greek and Roman literary corpora. Furthermore, Densher's survey of modern English scholarship revealed a tendency to characterize Samnium as anti-classical and the Samnites as the disorganized rural antithesis to the Romans. When the Samnites are compared with the likes of the Celts, Gauls, or Britons, other local populations which challenged Rome, it became apparent that the description of the barbaric tribes has also been extended by the Samnites by Livy, Polybius, and then a few other sources in antiquity. However, unlike the Celts, Gauls, and Britons, the notion of a barbaric Samnite mountain tribe has rarely been challenged by scholars, and notions of Samnium's autonomy and independent identity has been sidelined from a more traditional narrative of Roman imperialism. So the Romans come in, they build walls, and everything becomes Roman. Of course, there are more modern works by Raphael Scopacasa and Elizabeth Robinson, and this is just indicative of some of the more foundational scholarship in the area, this discussion. So to summarize, the Samnites are characterized in the ancient literature as disorganized and brutish, contrasted with the elegance and sophistication of the Romans. Modern understandings of the Samnites have been conditioned by these early imperial attitudes and consequently have framed the Samnites as the barbarian counterpart to Roman civilization. Yet the surviving archaeological evidence pertaining to Samnium offers an alternate picture. So I'll now very briefly discuss some of the material evidence that offers an alternative picture, of course. The archaeology shouldn't be taken as an impartial corrective to the literary evidence. However, I hope to demonstrate that looking at the material evidence with an alternative lens outside of Rome's inevitable colonization sheds a very different picture of Samnium and the Samnites. Although the Apennine Mountains are one of the key defining features of the central Italian region, the mountainous terrain encircles grassy plains and plateaus and river valleys, made ideal areas for grazing animals or land for agriculture. The main lines of communication, however, in these regions did not lie through paths at the bottom of the valleys, but also along the mountain ridges and were not vulnerable to flooding as a result. So the most active avenues of communication appear to have been the transhumance trails. Some of these are actually still in use by local populations as well, which is really cool. This geographic landscape encourages transhumance, where flocks are moved on seasonal cycles between lowland river valleys in the winter and green pastures in the highlands in the summer. Yet the existence of long-distance transhumance systems in antiquity through the Apennines has been widely debated in the modern scholarship, despite being quite widely attested in the ancient evidence. Transhumance trails acted as nexus points of cultural and economic activity in antiquity and represent socioeconomic systems of organization. The interlocking valleys and the network of rivers, mountain ridges, and upland passes facilitated mobility, and so Campania to the west and Umbria to the north would have been relatively accessible. So I'm going to start with Larinum as a case study. Larinum has been held up by both historians and archaeologists as an exception to the rest of central Italy in its development from the end of the 4th century onwards. It has also been used as an example of a nexus of interaction and mobility, which resisted Roman domination until the 1st century CE. And that's when it was given municipium status. So, in an apparent refusal to acknowledge Samnite autonomy and achievement, Larinum has been labelled as a city which shows cultural ambiguity due to its liminal position between Dornia, Apulia, and Samnium. So, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's just here. The available archaeological data on Larinum is substantial, so tomb assemblages from cemeteries in the area can be dated to as early as the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE. Between the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, Larinum demonstrates openness to northern Apulia, as demonstrated from the typology of imported Apulian products, as well as changes in funerary customs. At nearby Monte Arcano, burials contain grave goods and practices that can be linked to the customs of other Italian groups from nearby regions. Evidence from the excavations demonstrate both domestic occupation and agricultural activities beginning in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, and Larinum has a number of farmstead sites clustered around the ancient town, which become more concentrated further up the valley. And analysis of animal bone and vegetation suggests both agricultural and pastoral activity in the area. The lower valley provides the ideal conditions for pastoralism, and there is evidence of prevalent wool production in the nearby Apulia. So loom weights are a common find in the lower Biferno Valley more generally, and there is also evidence of textile production and fulling workshops have been found at Larinum. Therefore, it is likely that the farm areas surrounding Larinum participated in similar production and trade. Grain was the main crop in the Biferno Valley, and Larinum demonstrates high production of crops from an earlier period. Thus, the material evidence reflects vibrant systems of production and trade in the region, independent to Roman imperial activity. It didn't become a hub because Romans built roads to it. It was already a hub. Larinum had considerable production and manufacturing. It had its own workshops for painted wares, for imitation Nathian vessels and terracottas. The artisan quarter at Larinum revealed local stone sculpture from multiple working sites and evidence for ironworking. Furthermore, Larinum began to issue coins in 3rd century BCE, and we have evidence of a mint at Larinum from 100 BCE. The presence of infrastructure for production and trade, clustered rural sites surrounding Larinum, as well as the mint at the site indicate that it was connected to substantial trade networks and later participated in a monetized system. Larinum has traditionally been described as by scholars as semi-Samnite due to its size and the level of production in the town. And the town has been dubbed too sophisticated to have been an authentic rural Samnite settlement. It just doesn't fit their trope. So developments in the town have been attributed by scholars, so despite this evidence, have been attributed by scholars to Roman interference in the region. And there's an assumption that Larinum only began to really consolidate itself as a city in response to the inevitable Roman threat. When the factors of imperialism and Western understandings of colonialism are removed from the picture, Larinum reveals an independent hub of production and activity. Monte Polano is another really interesting one to look at. So on the right side of the Sangro River Valley lies the site of Monte Polano, and it rises above the Sangro River. The plateau overlooks the Adriatic coast, and yet the naturally fortified site presents a number of archaeological features that challenge the traditional image of rustic and isolated Samnites and their undeveloped warrior society. So there is reasonable access to the area, demonstrated from transhumance and communication routes throughout the area, and there is also evidence of pastoralism and remains of production sites in the region. Work on Monte Polano has revealed a fortified centre, a number of farmsteads in the surrounding landscape, and in particular at Fonte Campana, what are thought to have been early Roman settlement sites. The Sangro River Valley and Monte Polano regions disappear from the ancient literary record after 80 BCE when Sulla attacked the region. But the megalithic walls on Monte Polano have not been closely dated. Despite this, they're interpreted as evidence of a Samnite fortified centre during this period, driven by Livy's descriptions of Samnite settlements as Opida and the presence of Iron Age material evidence near to polygonal warning, and it's taken as indication of a Samnite hill fort site. So Livy referred to walled settlements as urbs, translated as city, and Opida translated as town. And the interesting thing about this is Opida has also been translated to denote defensible hill fortifications. The term is used by Livy, despite this, to refer to a number of cities and towns across the Mediterranean more widely. And so it's quite puzzling that scholars continue to use the term only to refer to Samnite fortifications. There's widespread use of these throughout southern Italy, especially in the 4th century region. So we see this Western understanding of urbanism also creeping into notions of Samnium. The last quick case study is Pietrabondante. So transhumance seems to have been an important aspect of the economy in this region. Processing of wool was also likely in these regions, as attested by literary sources which mention wool production throughout Apulia, Samnium, and Campania. Large material finds have also been found at Pietrabondante, where there is thought to have been quite a large Samnite sanctuary. De Fazio has argued that the form and dimension of the space are similar to the space described by Livy, where the Samnites took oaths prior to the Battle of Aquilonia. And this is also supported by work done by Tagliamonte, who says that the space was connected to the Samnite army due to the quantity of military dedications found at the site. And there's a fragmented Oscan inscription dated to around the 2nd century from the site, and it bears the words, Samnium with a sanctuary he adored, and censor. So it is likely that the structure served as a meeting place for various Samnite communities, and the dedications also illustrate a sense of collective identity between these groups, as well as connections between community spaces, ritual, religion, and patronage. So the theatre complex, which I believe is the one shown here, has been extensively studied as evidence of communal investment in the site. These buildings imply that the Samnites had developed socio-political organization beyond their hill forts, and thus a high level of development and movement existed in central Italy external to Roman networks. So, in sum, modern historians writing on the Roman Republic have often used the ancient sources to supplement their worldviews of the Western foundations of Rome, and thus they have perpetuated the ancient literary sources' emphasis on Rome's scale and influence at the expense of groups that have traditionally been othered. The systemic issues ingrained in the discipline of Roman Republican history have consequences which reach beyond issues of just diversity and access, having a cyclical impact on the interpretations of the ancient evidence, impacting how it is read, perceived, and how subsequent history is written by scholars. And although it's difficult to mitigate our natural confirmation biases when using the ancient sources, we often find ourselves looking for descriptions which resonate with our worldviews. And so it's important for us to actively challenge dichotomies perpetuated by many scholars of Western foundations and civilized versus the other and barbarian. Um, so I hope that this has demonstrated how important it is to be mindful of different perspectives and just really rethink how some of our evidence has been interpreted um, with our modern biases in mind. Thank you.